My name is Brooke. I'm 28, a veterinarian who runs a small clinic for elderly dogs and cats. But today, I wasn't a doctor. I was a secret walking into a room full of people who never knew I existed. It happened at my grandfather's funeral. The air smelled of lilies and old wood polish, the kind of scent that makes grief feel staged. I stood near the doorway, clutching the program, when my mother spotted me. Rona froze mid-conversation, her manicured hand tightening around her husband's arm. Her husband. The man she never told about me. And then I saw her perfect little family, Zachary, the successful businessman who thought he had married the perfect woman. Beside him, Sophie, their 18-year-old daughter, polished, radiant, the kind of daughter my mother could parade at dinners. Sophie tilted her head, studying me with open curiosity. "Mom, who is that?" she whispered. The silence that followed was louder than any eulogy. Rona's lips parted, searching for a lie. Zachary's eyes narrowed. And in that second, the story my mother had built for 21 years, her clean, polished life, began to crack. Before I tell you how that moment shattered everything, let me ask you. Have you ever discovered a secret so big it rewrote your entire childhood? Drop a comment below. I want to know I'm not alone. And subscribe, because what happened after my grandfather's funeral wasn't just about grief. It was about truth exploding in the middle of a perfect family portrait. My story began with silence. When my mother Rona was 19, she had me. My father was just a boy who liked fast cars and faster exits. The moment she told him about the pregnancy, he vanished. For him, I was nothing more than a complication he could outrun. For my mother's parents, my grandparents Evelyn and Walter, I was something worse, proof of failure. They were strict, proud people, pillars of their small community. To them, reputation was a currency more valuable than love. A daughter with a baby out of wedlock threatened that currency, and so the solution became obvious: hide the child. I was brought home from the hospital under cover of night. My grandmother hurried me inside, my grandfather parked the car down the street so no neighbor would see. My crib was wedged into the laundry room, between an ironing board and a stack of winter coats. It's just for now, they promised. But just for now stretched into years. I don't remember those earliest days, but I pieced them together through scraps of memory and overheard stories. Rona still lived at home, working shifts at a diner, sometimes stumbling in at midnight, smelling of coffee and perfume. She would hold me, kiss my hair, and whisper, "You're mine." But she was young and terrified. Whenever I called for her, whenever the word mama formed on my lips, my grandmother would hush me. "Not here, sweetheart. Call her Rona." I was barely 2 the first time I said it, "Mama," loud and proud. My grandmother froze. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she forced a laugh and shook her head. "Not now," she whispered. Even then, my identity as her daughter was conditional, something only allowed in shadows. By the time I was in preschool, I had already learned what other children didn't: how to shrink. At family gatherings, there were always photographs, Rona smiling with cousins, uncles, neighbors. But never with me. Once, I tried to squeeze beside her before the flash. My grandmother pulled me back. "Let them have their moment. You can take one later." But later never came. When I brought home drawings with gold stars from school, I taped one proudly to the refrigerator. The next morning it was gone, folded into a drawer. My grandmother patted my hand gently. Better to keep it safe. Safe became code for hidden. Even Christmas felt edited. Olivia, my cousin, received fancy dresses and photo shoots by the tree. My gifts were practical: socks, mittens, books without inscriptions. At 5 years old, I already understood I wasn't meant for display. The older I got, the more elaborate the rules became. First, my grandmother suggested Rona not take me along when she was out. Then, my grandfather showed me a new routine: never use the front door. He pressed a cool brass key into my palm, saying it was shorter to the kitchen. In truth, it was so neighbors wouldn't see me. The doorbell at the main entrance was taped over, broken, they told visitors. If I needed to come in, I was told to slip through the side gate, never the porch. And when curious neighbors asked about me, they were given the line I would hear repeated for years, "Oh, she's our niece. We just look after her sometimes." That was the year I stopped appearing in family photos altogether. The Christmas card went out featuring my grandparents, my mother, and their smiling neighbors' kids in matching sweaters. I was erased like a smudge on the lens. When I turned 7, my mother met Zachary. He was everything she had been trained to want: successful, polished, a businessman with ambition and a flawless reputation. I remember the day she introduced him at my grandparents' house. Before he arrived, she stormed through the rooms collecting my toys, my drawings, even my shoes by the door. Just until later, she muttered, hiding every trace of me. I crouched in the laundry room, the same room where my crib once stood, listening as laughter floated in from the kitchen. From that moment on, Zachary's presence tightened the silence around me. To him, Rona was a respectable young woman, not a single mother with baggage. And she planned to keep it that way. When I asked once why I couldn't meet him, why I had to stay out of sight, she crouched down with a brand new dress in her arms. "Because it's safer," she said. Safe meant invisible. Safe meant expendable. Safe meant her future mattered more than my existence. 3 years later, my half-sister Sophie was born. Her arrival was like the unveiling of a masterpiece. Balloons on the mailbox. Announcements in the local paper. Neighbors invited in to coo over her crib. My mother glowed as Zachary held the newborn for photos, the portrait of an ideal family. Meanwhile, I was shuffled further into the shadows. Whenever I craned toward the window, hoping for a glimpse of Rona with her new baby, my grandmother's hand would grip my shoulder. Not near the window. Still, when Rona visited me once a year for my birthday, she sometimes brought Sophie. I held her tiny fingers, whispered "I'm your sister" into her ear, though no one else acknowledged it. Sophie giggled and reached for me, innocent of the lies built around us. For a moment, I felt seen. Then the visit ended, and I was invisible again. So how does a family hide a child? Not with chains or locked doors. With rules. With silence. With constant reminders that love comes second to appearances. I grew up understanding 3 truths. 1. Fear: my existence was a threat to Rona's respectable life. 2. Status: my grandparents valued reputation more than honesty. 3. Convenience: once you start lying, it's easier to keep lying. By the time Sophie could walk, I had mastered the art of disappearing. I was the child no one mentioned, the name left off invitations, the face cropped out of photos. But even secrets grow. And like any living thing, I couldn't stay hidden forever. When I was 12, my mother and Zachary bought their dream home. A 2-story colonial with white shutters, a wraparound porch, and a backyard big enough for summer parties. The local newspaper even ran a small feature: "Businessman builds the perfect family nest." The photo showed Zachary in a tailored suit, Rona in a silk dress, and little Sophie in a frilly pink gown holding balloons. I wasn't in the picture. I wasn't even mentioned. By then I had stopped asking why. I knew the answer: I didn't fit the story. Once a year, my mother came back into my life, like a comet briefly streaking across the sky before vanishing again. Always on my birthday. Always with careful timing so Zachary would never notice. She brought gifts wrapped in glossy paper, perfume I was too young to wear, shoes that didn't quite fit, trendy tops I had no occasion for. For an hour or two she would smile, stroke my hair, and call me my girl. Then she would slip back into her shining life, leaving me with my grandparents and a hollow ache in my chest. I tried not to count the days between those visits, but I always did. 364 days of silence. 1 day of pretending. By the time I reached high school, the gulf between us had become impossible to cross. I joined the debate team, the animal rescue club, anything that might make her proud if she ever bothered to ask. She didn't. On the night of my sophomore year recital, I lingered near the auditorium doors, scanning the crowd. Parents milled about with cameras and bouquets, cheering their children. My grandmother sat alone in the back row, clapping politely. My mother had promised to come. She didn't. The same thing happened at science fairs, art shows, even one of my soccer games. I kept searching for her face in the stands, and every time I was reminded, I was not part of her story. At 17, when graduation came, I held out one last hope. Maybe she would show up for the cap and gown, the speeches, the photographs that filled yearbooks. I checked the crowd 3, 4, 5 times. My grandmother was there, pale but determined, clapping her thin hands together. My grandfather gave me a proud thumbs up. But the seat I saved in my heart for my mother remained empty. When the ceremony ended, friends posed for family pictures. I stood with my grandparents, smiling stiffly. Later, when I flipped through the glossy yearbook pages, I realized how invisible I really was. In a sea of family portraits, mine looked like a charity case. I left for college with a suitcase, a scholarship, and a secret wish that Rona might call to say she was proud. She never did. The only voice that kept me tethered was my grandfather's. He called every Sunday night. Sometimes it was small talk about the weather. Sometimes it was encouragement about exams or my part-time job at an animal shelter. And sometimes it was his quiet way of reminding me that I mattered. By then my grandmother's health had begun to fail. Diabetes. Heart problems. Each phone call carried another update, hospital visits, new medications, days when she barely left bed. I wanted desperately to go home, but classes and work kept me afloat financially, and Rona's silence made every trip feel like trespassing. The call came on a gray November morning, just after my 25th birthday. My grandfather's voice was heavy. "She's gone, Brooke. Your grandmother passed in her sleep last night." The words left me frozen. The woman who had raised me, who had both hidden and protected me, was simply gone. "I'm coming home," I said immediately, already reaching for my suitcase. But hours later, another call came, this time from my mother. Her voice was cold, rehearsed. "You don't need to come," Rona said flatly. "What are you talking about?" She was my grandmother. "This is a family matter," she snapped. "It's best you stay away. People will be there, neighbors, friends. It would only raise questions." Raise questions. That was her fear, even at a funeral. Not grief, not love, appearances. I begged. I shouted. I cried into the phone until my throat burned. But she ended the call with 4 words that cut deeper than any knife. "Don't make this harder." The funeral came and went without me. I sat in my small apartment, a candle burning on the windowsill, whispering goodbye into an empty room. My grandfather sent me a program from the service weeks later, folded carefully into an envelope. I studied the names printed there, the flowers described, the hymns sung. And in every detail, my absence screamed louder than any choir. From then on, my connection to my mother narrowed to almost nothing. The annual birthday visits stopped. Phone calls became myths. Sophie grew up in a polished world of family vacations and Christmas portraits, while I built my life through textbooks, night shifts, and the steady hum of responsibility. But through it all, my grandfather remained my anchor. He mailed me letters in his shaky handwriting, called whenever he could, and reminded me, over and over, that blood wasn't the only measure of family. Yet even he couldn't erase the truth. My mother had chosen her perfect house, her perfect husband, her perfect child. And she had chosen it without me. By the time I turned 25, I had learned 2 things. 1. Some people would rather bury their secrets than face them. 2. And sometimes, the hardest funerals are the ones you aren't allowed to attend. I thought that was the end of the story. But I was wrong. Because secrets don't stay buried forever. And when they finally surface, they demand to be reckoned with. By 26, I had stopped waiting for Rona's calls. They weren't coming. Instead, I poured my energy into something that had always made sense to me: animals. Dogs and cats never asked where you came from, never demanded explanations for missing faces in your family albums. They loved, or they didn't, but at least you always knew where you stood. It started small. A storefront at the edge of town, its windows dusty and its sign half broken. Most people would have walked past without a second glance. But when I saw it, I imagined kennels lined with warm blankets, medicine cabinets filled with supplies, and patients whose gray muzzles and cloudy eyes didn't make them any less worthy of care. I signed the lease with money scraped together from scholarships, part-time jobs, and a small grant for young entrepreneurs. My grandfather, still my lifeline, mailed me a check with shaky handwriting in the memo line, for Brooks' dream. Within months, the Haven was open, a clinic dedicated to elderly pets. The ones most people gave up on. The ones families abandoned when care became inconvenient. To me, they were kindred spirits. Overlooked, underestimated, but still full of life. Word spread slowly, then quickly. Retired couples brought in their old Labradors. Single mothers brought cats their children had grown up with. Volunteers came after school to walk dogs whose legs moved slower each week. The clinic filled with life, and in that life I finally felt a sense of home. Running the Haven wasn't easy. There were nights I slept on the office couch, listening to the hum of oxygen machines, praying an old shepherd would make it until morning. But I wasn't alone anymore. Olivia, no, not my cousin Olivia, but a college friend with the same name, became my right hand at the clinic. She handled scheduling, paperwork, and the occasional breakdown when I couldn't hold back tears in front of grieving owners. You can't save them all, she reminded me, but you can make their last days matter. Then there was Marcus, a veterinary tech with tattoos of paw prints climbing up his arm. He had grown up in foster care, shuffled from one house to another, and when he heard my story, he just nodded. Family isn't DNA, he said simply. It's who stays. Together, we built more than a clinic. We built community. On Saturday mornings, kids painted paw print murals on the walls. Retired nurses volunteered to sit with recovering animals, humming lullabies while they healed. It was messy, chaotic, and underfunded, but it was real. That was when I met Ethan. He brought in an old beagle named Rosie with arthritis so bad she could barely climb the stairs to his apartment. She's my girl, he said, his voice cracking as he helped lift her onto the exam table. I just want her to be comfortable. We talked for an hour that first day, about medications, diet, physical therapy. But then we talked about more. About books. About music. About how both of us felt like outsiders in our own families. He came back every week with Rosie, and every week our conversations stretched longer. By the time Rosie passed peacefully in her sleep 6 months later, Ethan and I were sitting together on the clinic floor, holding her paw. Afterward, he turned to me with tears in his eyes. You gave her dignity, he whispered. You gave me peace. Love didn't come all at once. It unfolded quietly, like a flower too shy to bloom in full sun. But soon, Ethan was part of my days, helping with late-night emergencies, cooking simple dinners when I was too tired, holding me when old memories clawed their way back. For the first time, I began to believe I could have a life not defined by absence, but by presence. Life wasn't flawless. The clinic constantly fought to stay afloat. Bills piled high, equipment broke, and grief was a frequent visitor. There were still nights when I cried myself to sleep, missing the family I never really had. But there were also mornings filled with wagging tails and purring patients. Afternoons with friends who showed up without excuses. Evenings with Ethan, who never asked me to be prettier, calmer, or different, just asked me to be. One evening, as I locked up the clinic, Marcus slapped my shoulder and said, "You know, this place feels more like family than any home I've lived in." I smiled, feeling the truth of it settle deep in my chest. My mother had built her flawless picture, perfect house, perfect husband, perfect daughter. But I had built something imperfect and alive. A place where no one was hidden, no one erased. By the time I turned 27, I realized something I never thought possible. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for Rona's approval. Not for her phone calls. Not even for her presence at milestones she would inevitably miss. I had found my people, my work, my place. It wasn't the family I was born into, but it was the family I chose. And in its warmth, I began to heal. But healing doesn't erase history. And history has a way of catching up, especially secrets buried for nearly 3 decades. And the day my grandfather died, all those buried truths came crashing back into the open. As usual, the phone rang on Sunday. But it wasn't my grandfather's voice this time. It came from a man who introduced himself as Arthur Hale, the estate attorney. His voice was precise, the kind that irons out emotion. "Ms. Brooke," he said, as if testing how my name fit in his mouth, "I'm calling on behalf of your grandfather, Walter. I'm sorry to inform you he passed away early this morning. The family has arranged a funeral for Saturday. There is also the reading of the will. Mr. Walter left specific instructions that you be notified and present." For a second the clinic around me went out of focus, the posters on the walls, the hum of the oxygen machine, the soft rasp of a sleeping terrier. The word present struck me hardest. My mother had erased me from so many rooms that the idea of being asked, no, required, to show up made my legs shaky. "I'll be there," I said. My voice didn't tremble. Somehow, that felt like a small miracle. Ethan insisted on driving. "You shouldn't do this alone," he said, pressing a thermos of coffee into my hands while Marcus promised to cover the weekend at the Haven. On the highway, gray clouds curled low over the town that had taught me to use back doors. I watched the landmarks slide past, the grocery store with the sun-faded awning, the school where I'd sat alone at concerts, the church whose bells marked milestones I was never invited to celebrate. We pulled into the cemetery lot 20 minutes early. The lilies hit me first, their sweet, suffocating scent drifting from a cluster of sprays rimmed in white ribbon. People gathered in careful black, the kind of black that looks expensive in photographs. Near the casket stood my mother, Rona, immaculate in a fitted coat. Beside her was Zachary in a somber suit, hand on her elbow. And between them, a young woman with soft brown hair and clear eyes. Sophie. I stood by the oak tree and watched them for a breath too long. Then Rona turned, and saw me. The color left her face in a clean sweep, as if someone had wiped it off with a cloth. Her hand tightened on Zachary's arm. He followed her gaze, puzzled, then polite. And when his eyes reached mine, nothing. No recognition. Why would there be? Sophie tilted her head, curiosity prickling at the edges of her expression. "Mom?" I heard her ask. "Who is that?" Rona's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I could have stayed under the tree and let the day pass like every other day that hadn't included me. Instead, I stepped onto the path and walked forward. I stopped at the casket first, laid my palm on the wood, whispered, "Thank you," into the seam where a lid met base. "Thank you for the Sunday calls. For the envelope that said for Brooke's dream. For loving me as best you knew how while helping hide me because you didn't know better." Then I turned to the living. "Rona," I said. I didn't call her Mom. Not here. Not anymore. "Brooke," she breathed, like a prayer and a problem. Zachary extended his hand politely. "I'm Zachary Weston. Thank you for coming." His voice carried the assumption that I was a distant cousin, a neighbor, a volunteer from church. A safe answer. I could have let him keep it. "I'm Brooke," I said. "Walter's granddaughter." The surface of the crowd rippled. People shifted. Rona blinked like a flash had gone off too close to her eyes. Zachary's hand dropped, confusion clouding his practiced composure. "Granddaughter?" Sophie repeated softly, looking from me to Rona. I thought, she didn't finish. Rona's fingers found the pearl at her throat. "We should begin," she murmured to no one, to everyone. "Please, let's take our seats." The service was beautiful and brief, a litany of praise for a careful man who mowed lawns in diagonal lines and could fix anything with a screwdriver and patience. I listened, chest tight, as the pastor spoke about legacy. What we leave behind, he said, are the truths we live by. After the last amen, people drifted toward the hall for coffee and cake. Arthur Hale approached, trim and composed, a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. "Ms. Brooke," he said with a small bow of the head. "If you're ready, Mr. Walter requested the will be read in the family room at the house. Only immediate family present." His eyes flicked to Rona and Zachary, waiting. "Of course," I answered, even as the words stung. Immediate family had always been the cord that cinched me out. We drove in a quiet little procession to the house I'd grown up in, a place that smelled like lemon oil and secrets. Inside, the family room looked smaller than I remembered. Same couch. Same framed photographs arranged on the mantel in curated happiness. Still no trace of me. We took our places, Rona and Zachary on the couch, Sophie in a chair by the window, me on the edge of the ottoman. Ethan stood discreetly near the doorway until Rona, surprised Ethan had followed, said tightly, "This is for family." Arthur cleared his throat. Mr. Walter's instructions included Ms. Brooke's guest, if she wished one. Rona's eyes flashed, but she said nothing more. Arthur opened the folder and began, "Bequests to the church, to an animal shelter," I swallowed, "small sums to cousins." Then he reached for a sealed envelope with my name. "Ms. Brooke," he said gently, offering it to me. My hand shook, just once. I slid my finger beneath the flap and unfolded my grandfather's precise handwriting. "My girl," it began. "I should have done better. I thought silence protected you. I see now that it only protected our pride. If any of this can be counted as setting things right, let it begin with telling the truth out loud." My throat closed. I read the next line silently, then looked up at Arthur. "Mr. Walter instructed me to read a short statement," he said, lifting a second paper. His voice was steady, but the words cracked the room in half. For the avoidance of doubt, he read, "Brooke is my daughter Rona's child. We raised Brooke in our home. We hid this because we were ashamed. I ask that we stop hiding now." Silence pressed on the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen a pipe knocked, as if the house itself objected to honesty. Sophie's fingers whitened on the chair arm. Zachary exhaled long and slow. Rona stood abruptly. "Arthur, this is inappropriate." "It's Mr. Walter's will," Arthur replied. These were his words, not mine. Zachary turned to Rona, body angled away from the performance and toward the person. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. "Rona?" I watched the muscles in her jaw work. I watched the 20 years she'd spent polishing her life into something spotless collide with the one thing polish can't survive, light. "Yes," she said at last. The word was so small I almost missed it. "It's complicated." Sophie's breath hitched. "You told me you said we were," she stopped, shaking her head. "How could you not tell me I have a sister?" Rona reached for her daughter's hand. Sophie pulled it back. Arthur continued, voice unobtrusive. "There's one more provision. Mr. Walter bequeaths the small cottage on Ames Street to Brooke, and a sum designated for the continued operation of her veterinary clinic. He asked me to say, use it to love what others overlook." I closed my eyes. Grief and gratitude hit in the same wave. Zachary rubbed a hand over his mouth. "All this time," he murmured. "We built a life on omission. We built a life on hope," Rona snapped, as if volume could change meaning. I was 19. I made choices I had to make. "No," I said quietly. Every eye swiveled toward me. "You made choices you wanted to make. And you made me carry them." Rona flinched. "You don't understand what it was like." "You're right," I answered. "I only understand what it was like for me." The room seemed to tilt, just a degree. Ethan's presence at my shoulder steadied it. Sophie stood. She was trembling, not with hysteria, but with the thin fury of someone seeing the frame around their life bend. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked again, softer. "I would have loved her." "I do," her voice broke. "I do." Rona pressed fingers to her temple. "Because people judge. Because I was finally building something good. Because I didn't want to lose it." Zachary's voice was almost tender. "Rona," he said, and the way he said her name sounded like a tired man setting down a heavy box, "I don't know what we lose now. But I know what we never should have cost." He looked at me. He faltered. "Sorry" is a small word stacked against a large harm. "I didn't know," he finished, "and sometimes that's the only true thing available." Arthur cleared his throat again, the gentle bailiff of our ruins. "There's one final item," he said. "Mr. Walter left a note addressed to whoever is holding on to a lie." He raised his brows, then read. "You can keep a secret. Or you can keep a family. In my experience, you don't get both." No one spoke for a long time. When we finally drifted from the family room to the kitchen, the air tasted different, like a window had been pried open in a stale house. People whispered in the hallway, little ripples of speculation lapping at the door jambs. I stood by the sink, staring at the ceramic rooster clock that had watched me learn to pour milk without spilling. Rona came in, closed the door behind her, and leaned against it as if it could hold her up. "You weren't supposed to be here," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Not like this." "I was supposed to be here my whole life," I replied. "You're just noticing." She winced. "I did what I had to do to survive." I thought of the paper cake on my 3rd birthday. Of the key to the back gate at 7. Of the taped doorbell and the whispered "not here." Of the funeral I wasn't allowed to attend when my grandmother died. "You survived," I said. I disappeared. "Brooke," she reached out, then let her hand fall. "Can we talk? Later." "Not today. I need time." I nodded once. I hadn't come for war. I'd come for a goodbye, and for the truth to finally speak in a house where it had been gagged. When I turned to leave, Sophie stood in the doorway, eyes glossy. For a heartbeat we just looked at each other, two versions of a life our mother had tried to draw with a single set of lines. "Do you like coffee?" she blurted, and then laughed through the tears at the absurdity of it. "I mean, obviously. Everyone likes coffee." I'd like to see your clinic. If that's okay." It took me a second to find my voice. "It's more than okay," I said. "Come Saturday mornings. We let the kids paint paw prints on the walls." She smiled, small and real. "I'm not a kid." "Neither was I," I said. And that was the problem. We exchanged numbers. It felt like sliding a window a little farther open. On the way out, I passed the mantel again. The same curated photograph stared back. I didn't take any down. I didn't add one. I just reached into my pocket, pulled out my grandfather's letter, and tucked it into my coat like a compass. Outside, the lilies still smelled too sweet. The sky had begun to clear. Ethan laced his fingers through mine. "How are you?" he asked. "Not erased," I said. The words surprised me with how right they felt. He squeezed my hand. "That's a start." We walked to the car. Behind us, the perfect house stood exactly as it always had, white shutters winking in the weak sun. But inside it, the floorboards had shifted. And once a house shifts, you can level it, you can shore it up, but you can't pretend it was never crooked. Secrets had been our architecture. Today, the truth laid the first honest beam. And whether that truth would build us something new, or burn down what was left, would be decided in the days to come. My mother never forgave me. After the funeral, after the truth slipped into daylight where even she couldn't hide it anymore, Rona wrapped herself in self-pity like a winter coat. She told anyone who would listen that I had humiliated her, that I had ruined the image she had worked so hard to protect. To her, it wasn't the decades of lies that broke the family, it was me daring to exist in public. She never called again. Not once. But something unexpected happened in the silence she left behind. The very people she had feared losing turned toward me instead. Zachary wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed being deceived. He had built his business on reputation and trust, and when he learned that his wife had hidden an entire daughter from him for nearly 2 decades, something between them fractured. They didn't divorce, not yet. But the distance was obvious. He stopped bragging about her at work events. He stopped holding her hand at church. And most tellingly, he started spending his weekends not in their perfect house, but in my imperfect clinic, asking how he could help. "I can manage donations," he told me one Saturday, rolling up the sleeves of his cashmere sweater as if he had never worn anything but work gloves. "Supplies, grants, networking. Let me put my connections to good use." I wanted to resist at first. But when an influential businessman starts phoning pharmaceutical reps on behalf of old dogs and arthritic cats, you don't say no. Then there was Sophie. For years, I had been a ghost story to her, something whispered about behind closed doors, the shadow her mother never wanted her to see. Now she saw me clearly. At first, she came shyly, dropping by the clinic after school, pretending it was just on her way home. She would crouch by the kennels, talking to the animals in a voice softer than I had ever heard her use with people. One evening she asked, "Did you ever hate me? For having what you didn't?" I shook my head. "No. None of this was your fault. You didn't know." She cried then, stroking the muzzle of a blind retriever. And after that, she stopped pretending. She came every week, volunteering, cleaning cages, feeding strays. She became not just my half-sister but my friend, the kind of sister I had once imagined in childhood before secrets built walls between us. When Ethan asked me to marry him, it wasn't under a canopy of roses or in some expensive restaurant. He proposed right there in the clinic yard, kneeling beside a geriatric German shepherd who barked approvingly at the commotion. I said yes through tears and laughter, and the staff cheered. But what stunned me most was who showed up at the engagement party 2 weeks later. Not my mother. But Zachary and Sophie, walking into the decorated barn with armfuls of flowers and a donation envelope so thick it nearly burst. Zachary raised his glass. "To Brooke and Ethan," he said, his voice firm. "May your marriage be built on honesty, the strongest foundation there is." And Sophie whispered in my ear, "You're the sister I choose." Rona wasn't there. She never called, never wrote. She stayed in her perfect house with her curated friends, telling herself the same old story, that she had done everything for the best, that she had protected her family, that she had been right. But she was alone in that story. Zachary stopped defending her. Sophie stopped believing her. And I stopped needing her. Today, when I walk through the clinic, past the mural of paw prints painted by children, past the kennels filled with animals who have found a second chance, I feel something I never thought I would: peace. I didn't get the mother I wanted. I didn't get the family I deserved. But I got the truth. I got the chance to build a different kind of home. And when I look at Ethan, when I see Sophie laughing with the dogs, when I catch Zachary hammering together a donation box like he's building an empire, I realize something simple. Blood gave me secrets. Choice gave me family. And that is enough.